Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our double bill today. And we hone in on Operation Infatuate II as part of our Scheldt series today. Stephen Fisher returns to the channel to talk about Support Squadron on the Eastern Flank as part of the amphibious assault. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Stephen. Are you going to do the joke about what I had written on my little post-it?
No, I'm going to let you do that.
So folks, I always write my introduction on a post-it note and I put it on the screen at my eye level and then I read it out. And for some reason, I had written, instead of Stephen Fisher, I'd written Stephen Fuhrer. And I can only think I was thinking about Wereaboos on the YouTube comments or something. And I was just about to bring Stephen. I thought, why have I written Stephen Fuhrer? But we'll keep on calling you Stephen Fisher. I think it's better. But anyway,
it's more PC.
More PC, but you know, who knows? It might kick off as a social media handle. But the interesting thing about, to get to the subject of Walcheren and the Scheldt, is that you're right in the middle of researching this now, aren't you, for your next tome? And as I'm discovering with this series, there's a hell of a lot more to this battle than perhaps people realize. An incredible amount of moving parts, in some ways way more complicated than D-Day.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. There's a lot that people don't know. There's a lot that I don't know. I'm rapidly finding out so much more. I thought I knew a lot. I did know a lot. As I uncover more things, I suddenly realize there's so much more detail. There is a lot about this operation because it's quite small in the grand scheme of things. There's actually a lot of detail on it, because it's the last amphibious operation in Northwest Europe as well,
right? Yeah.
And also only the second amphibious operation carried out against the Atlantic Wall. There is a lot of paperwork. Essentially, there's lots of reports that were filed after it from all three services: the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. There's all sorts of detail gone into, and I'll touch on a little bit of that in a moment. But yeah, there's a huge amount to discover, and I think also as well the repercussions, the role of this operation in the broader story of Northwest Europe as well. There's a lot more to unpick there that I don't think has had that much attention paid to it lately. You know, the role in opening up the Scheldt and
well, this has been, as we've covered on the channel, we've covered Aachen and Arnhem, and Antwerp and the Scheldt has always come up in those conversations about the options the Allies have ahead of them in sort of September, October, November 44, and the broad front, narrow front, Montgomery, Eisenhower, and that has realized that it's connected all these dots, which is quite cool. But we're going off on a rabbit hole already, so Stephen's come with loads of slides, so we're going to hand over to him to take us through this. And yeah, we'll fire away with your questions. But as you'll know, with Mr. Fisher, there'll be lots of detail provided. But over to you, sir.
Right, thank you, Woody. Hello, everyone. So for my talk, after Paul invited me to do a presentation for Scheldt Week, I thought I'd narrow in on something very, very specific and very detailed, and that is just one unit of the landing craft that participated in Operation Infatuate II, the landings at Westkapelle. So I don't want to get bogged down in the bigger story of Walcheren or the Scheldt campaign, but yeah, just to summarize, I suppose. Obviously, as most of you will know, the operation is to open up the port of Antwerp, which is actually just off this map. Sorry about that. It's down in the bottom right corner. But in order to open Antwerp to shipping, it was necessary to clear the Scheldt, which is that river running along the south of that map in front of you, because the Germans still controlled all of the approaches to it on the south side, on Belgium and a little bit of the Netherlands, and then on the north side, the coast of the Netherlands, and in particular that island of Walcheren. Now, the primary objective of all of this was, yes, to clear the approaches, move the troops along the land, and eventually through operations Switchback and I forget the other one. Can you remember the name of the other one?
Sorry.
No. Vitality, that's it. Switchback Vitality, and Vitality, yeah. To operate clear those bits of land, and then hone in on the vitally important island of Walcheren. Now, at the time, this was still an island. It's only just connected to the mainland, to South Beveland, by that causeway, but otherwise it's totally cut off from everywhere else. Now it's part of the mainland through land reclamation and the closing of the causeway channel. that island was the key. And that's why that's the subject of my book. I've picked one bit of the wider Scheldt campaign because without capturing Walcheren Island, everything else is for nothing, because on Walcheren are all of the heavy gun batteries that really control the entrance to the Scheldt estuary. So once the armies have advanced across land along South Beveland, then they still have to capture that island. Everything else is building up to that, essentially. And the capture of Walcheren, I don't want to go into too much detail again on this either. And if you're watching this later on, don't watch it now because we're live. But if you are just starting watching this later on Catch Up, then go away and watch this talk that Tobias gave yesterday, explaining the capture of Walcheren, the grander strategy for it, and the overall campaign to capture Walcheren, which is, yeah, as I said, going to be the subject of my book. But Tobias gave an absolutely brilliant talk yesterday. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I haven't met Tobias yet. I hope maybe I'll be able to meet him this weekend. But I have met his co-author, Hans Sackers, and many of the other people from the Stichting Bunkerveld Foundation, who work to preserve a lot of the Second World War artifacts and sites on Walcheren Island. People like Johan, Raoul, Jos Vogel, Mark. They've all been extraordinarily helpful to me, and I owe them a great deal for some of the information that I've started to uncover. But the subject I'm going to talk about is very much my sort of subject, if you like, because it's landing craft, and I think most of you know that landing craft is very much my thing. So the capture of Walcheren is going to take place in 3 different assaults. There's the island staring out into the North Sea. The reason it needs to be captured is mainly because of these. These are the principal coastal batteries on the island, code numbered by the Germans, W11, W13, W15, W17, W19. These were all coastal batteries, so capable of firing at targets offshore, shipping, that sort of thing. They were a mix of different sizes of batteries, although they were very well ensconced into concrete bunkers. Allied intelligence had a few details wrong. W11, for instance, W11 and W13, they both were believed to have 6 150mm guns. In fact, they only had 4 150mm guns each. W15, which is right next to Westkapelle, where our landing area is going to be, that was believed to have 4 150mm guns. In fact, it had 4 3.7-inch British anti-aircraft guns that had been captured in 1940. So nothing quite as powerful as had been originally imagined, 150mm guns, but still dangerous, and still, again, a target that needs to be neutralized in order to clear the Scheldt estuary and make it available to shipping. W17, a little bit further up the coast, French 220mm guns. And then W19, again, assumes to be 105mm guns. These were, in fact, again, British 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft guns. But nonetheless, these are the principal targets, and also the greatest hazard to any attempt to try and make a landing from the sea, which is going to factor into what happens to the Support Squadron Eastern Flank. Now, the principal attack routes then, one across the causeway from South Beveland over to the east. So this is where the Allies have already moved up through South Beveland, and they're going to make a frontal assault along this nearly mile-long causeway. An attack on Vlissingen or Flushing on the south of the island. That's going to be made across the Scheldt causeway from Breskens to the south. So this is almost like, it's a little bit like a river crossing, just quite a wide river. That's going to be carried out by 4 Commando and 52nd Lowland Brigade. That's Operation Infatuate I, but I'm not going there in this talk. Where we're focusing our attention is up there on the top left, and that is Operation Infatuate II. And this is the proper amphibious landing, which will be made on the village of Westkapelle, with the intent of then enabling our forces to spread out and work their way across the island. So once they've got a toehold in these 3 different places, they're going to work their way up the coast and basically overcome these batteries. That's the primary objective. Once the batteries are clear, then the Allies can work to clear the Scheldt estuary of mines, which Nick talked about yesterday.
Yep.
So this is the primary objective of this landing.
Quick question from Merrin about the reach of the gun batteries seawards in terms of range.
I can't remember off the top of my head, Merrin. It's a good couple of miles, but of course these are for W-15. They're only heavy anti-aircraft guns, so their range is not far. Easily, our shipping can still operate out in the North Sea, just as long as it doesn't get too close to Westkapelle. But their range was sufficient to basically, if they wanted to, they could shell Breskens, for instance. That was no problem. They closed the Scheldt estuary entirely. So they were enough of a hazard that they had to be overcome in order for the Scheldt to be cleared.
Okay, thank you.
I'll check their range in a minute. I've got a document that will tell me that straight away. So with this anticipation that there will have to be an amphibious landing, Admiral Ramsey, who is still in command of all of the naval operations happening in the Northwest Europe theatre, appoints this gentleman, Anthony Pugsley, to command the naval operation, or the naval aspect of the operation. And this being amphibious, he is essentially the de facto commander of everything that's going to happen, at least on D-Day, on day one. Pugsley has served on destroyers. He was at Normandy, at Juno Beach, in command of the assault wave for the Canadians. So he's well used to this level of operations, and he's appointed to his role in mid-September. So he's basically got about 6 weeks to prepare for this operation. Now, that is not long. And as I'll explain in a minute, that does start to show through some of the preparations for this operation. He is given this new command. He's essentially made the commander of Force T, a brand new naval amphibious force, but he has nothing in it. So instead, he is given permission to take as much as he needs from Force J, his old command, and he basically then strips Force J of all of its shipping, which is 4 flotillas of landing craft tank who will carry out the landings, putting ashore the infantry, and the Support Squadron Eastern Flank. That's the next major important unit within Force T. So these 3 people are all characters from Sword Beach on D-Day. On the right, Commander Edwin Curry, who was on LCH 185. He led the assault wave in. He basically steered the DD tanks into D-Day, into Sword Beach on D-Day. In the middle, Captain Bush, he was in command of the entire assault wave on Sword Beach on D-Day. And then on the left, Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Sellars, known as Monkey Sellars, because he was a rugby player before the war. It looks like quite an unassuming gent, to be honest. He looks a bit older than he actually is, but fairly quiet-looking chap, if you ask me, in that picture. But he is the commander of Support Squadron Eastern Flank, this curiously named unit, which basically consists of all manner of unusual modified landing craft. Now, Pugsley has under his command for the assault at Westkapelle quite a large naval unit, which consists of his headquarters ship, HMS Kingsmill. This is where he'll be on D-Day, on the assault day, commanding operations. Behind him, further out to sea, he has considerable firepower support from HMS Warspite and 2 monitors. So all of them armed with 15-inch guns, Erebus and Roberts, who are there to provide the heavy shelling, the beach saturation just before the landings take place. They will be guided in, or sorry, their fire will be guided by spotter planes that will fly out from the UK on D-Day, and they, of course, are attended by a destroyer screen who are there to protect them from any interference from out at sea. So they're well out of the range of most of the guns that are on Westkapelle. They're not really part of the assault force, if you see what I mean. They're more of the bombardment force. Then there's the landing craft themselves that are going to carry out the landings. Now there's a couple of different flotillas involved in this. There's 202 landing craft infantry small flotilla. So there's about a dozen of these Fairmile H landing crafts. These are wooden landing craft made by the Fairmile Company, who are more famous for making motor torpedo boats. These landing craft have taken part in D-Day. These are the vessels that carried Lord Lovett's commandos to Sword Beach and 48 Royal Marine Commando onto Juno Beach. They're not the most practical type of landing craft because they don't have a bow ramp. They have little ramps that are pushed over the bow. You can see them on the front there, and the commandos are supposed to clamber down those to get onto the beach. And in fact, not all of the commandos were happy to have these, and 48 Commando, under the command of James Moulton, they had such a torrid time on Juno Beach on D-Day that Moulton just flat out refused to be carried to Westkapelle on this type of vessel. The other units were aware of the dangers of these vessels as well, and so in fact only 41 Royal Marine Commando were taken on these. The rest are all transported by landing craft tank. This is the Mark IV landing craft tank, the most mass produced of all of the British landing craft, and they are going to carry their cargo of men, which is principally 4th Special Service Brigade, so 41, 47 and 48 Royal Marine Commandos. They will take them ashore in amphibious trucks, landing craft track. Landing craft vehicle track. No, landing vehicle track, LVT. Sorry. And I've just completely forgotten the more common name for them. What are they called? Not alligators.
Yeah, no, it's not in my head either. I'm terrible, right?
Somebody will pick up on the sidebar.
Yeah, someone know. Yeah. Buffalo.
Buffalo. Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Patrick, and everyone else who's now saying it. I love it when that happens. You think you know the name for something that just vanishes. Anyway, all of the Royal Marine Commandos of 47 and 48 Commando are going to be carried in these Buffaloes on the decks of the LCTs. So the LCTs will get close into the shore, and then they will launch the Buffaloes into shallow water and into the mud, basically, and then they can get the troops up onto firmer ground. So to support this operation, then there's this multitude of other types of landing craft. Now, inevitably, there's motor launches, Fairmile B motor launches. They're going to be providing escort duties, navigational roles. They'll be marking some of the sandbanks offshore. There's quite a few landing craft personnel large, which is the vessel in the foreground and attending this ML. Another type of landing craft, basically on all sorts of duties, general messenger duties, rescue work, that sort of thing. They're not actually going to be making the landing themselves. They're there to provide escort and assistance. The bulk of Support Squadron Eastern Flank is commanded by two types of unusual landing craft, the LCH, which you can see nestled in this flotilla of landing craft awaiting D-Day in Southampton docks. The LCH is a landing craft infantry that's been heavily modified, and they've taken out all of the crew space and they've used that to fit radios, radar, all sorts of additional information. So this can literally work as a floating headquarters where the commanders can easily communicate with all of their vessels, the troops, and that sort of thing. And this is what Sellars will be sailing on. There's a second one as well, so that he can exert overall control of his support squadron. The vessels then that they are commanding in Support Squadron Eastern Flank are these modified LCTs. Now, the most prominent one is the Landing Craft Gun. So this is a Landing Craft Mark III that has been modified by having the tank deck decked over and two 4.7-inch guns installed on the tank deck instead. Now, this one is a training exercise. It's making smoke. It's not on fire, but you will see a very similar picture a little bit later on, actually. So these two 4.7-inch guns on the deck are manned by Royal Marines. So not commandos. This is Royal Marines in their traditional role of providing the sort of infantry role on a ship, if you like. So these are very handy because a landing craft is a very shallow draft vessel. They can get in very close to the shore. The 4.7-inch gun is a very capable gun, and they can provide very close fire support to landing craft as they go into the shore. They are partnered by the Landing Craft Flak, a very similar type of vessel, The ones at Walcheren were all Mark IV landing craft, but other than that, pretty much the same sort of thing. They've decked over the tank deck, and on that they've fitted all sorts of anti-aircraft guns, 20mm Oerlikons, 6-pounder pom-poms, that sort of thing. Now, these are much shorter range vessels. Originally, they were intended to provide anti-aircraft support and engage air targets during an amphibious operation, but with the pretty much the defeat of the Luftwaffe by now, on D-Day, they mainly engaged targets on the beach, and that was going to be their role at Walcheren as well. So they would also help saturate the beach with heavy gunfire and engage targets as the landing craft went ashore. Probably the most well-known modification of a landing craft is the landing craft tank rocket, fitted with 1,100 2-pound rockets of the sort that would be carried by a Typhoon, which could be launched in several waves, if you like, at a range of about 3,000 yards, and these are absolutely terrifying. If you've ever seen video footage of them launching their salvos of rockets, they made a heck of a noise. Most people usually comment on the screeching noise that they made as they launch a huge salvo of rockets onto the beach. They're not the most accurate of weapons, but again, with a huge salvo of those rockets coming down on a target, it's going to keep the enemy's heads down, basically, and they were very effective in that way. The fourth type of vessel that the support squadron is using is the Landing Craft Support Large, which is another Fairmile. It's the Landing Craft Infantry Small that I just showed you that the commandos will be using, 41 Commando will be using to get ashore, but it's been modified to become a sort of floating gunship. You have a 6-pounder anti-tank gun on the front in a Valentine turret, and then you have Oerlikons, pom-pom guns, and that sort of thing on the stern. Again, being a very shallow draft, so this is designed to get in close and fire armor-piercing shot or high explosive shot at targets, bunkers primarily, and again keep the enemy's heads down. The benefit of these landing craft is they can get in as close to the beach as the landing craft carrying the infantry. They can go right up onto the shore, so they are very, very effective in this role. That said, none of them are actually intended to beach. They're supposed to stay just offshore. But joining this little eclectic collection of vessels for the Walcheren operation was a brand new type of landing craft, the Landing Craft Gun Medium. Now, this was intended to beach. This is a purpose-designed hull. It's not a landing craft hull that's been modified. It's actually purpose-built, but they call it a landing craft gun anyway, because, yes, its intention is that it will actually beach on the shore. It has flooding compartments in the hull, so it can take on a large amount of water as ballast, goes ashore, settles onto the seabed. When it's time to leave, it will then pump out that water so it becomes buoyant again and use its kedge anchor to pull off. But the idea of this vessel is that it actually beaches on the shore and engages targets at near point-blank range. It has two 17-pounder anti-tank guns in those armoured turrets. It has an armoured citadel, if you like, in the middle where the magazines are stored below deck. And you can see there's an open bridge on that vessel, but there's also an armoured bridge just in front and below it, where the captain of the vessel and also the commander of the gun positions can range on their targets from an armor-plated little strong room, if you like. So this is a brand new type of vessel. This was going to be its first use. And in fact, as far as I've ever been able to tell, it was the only time they actually saw action. So there's a lot of attention being paid to these vessels, which is quite handy for me. So I've had quite a few questions on social media over the last couple of months since my book came out about how do I structure my research for when I'm doing these stories and trying to work everything out. So for this particular one, there's a plethora of reports about what happens at Westkapelle. So I've managed to create a folder for every vessel that is in the landings, the landing craft tank and all of the support squadron Eastern Flank. So there you get folders of information for each vessel, and into those, this is a sort of average one. This is Landing Craft Gun Large number 1. There's a mix there of different reports. There's survivor statements. There's medal recommendations. There's the report from the commanding officer that was then sent to Commander Sellars as part of the wash up, if you like, afterwards. So there's lists of survivors there. There's all sorts of documents, and I compile all of that into the one folder so that I've got, if you like, the narrative for that vessel all in one place. So that's a fairly average looking one. For Landing Craft Gun Medium 101, those new types of vessels, there is a lot of stuff. There were 2 senior officers on board, Lieutenant Flamank was the skipper of the ship, but there was also the officer commanding the Royal Marine gun crews. I've forgotten his name, Tilbury, I think. There were 2 observers on board. There was Captain, what was his name? Captain Scott Miller from Combined Operations Headquarters, so he was observing, and then there was also Captain Peretz, who was from the Royal School of Gunnery, who was observing exactly how well the guns performed. So there's a lot of detailed reports.
Why do you think so much was taken in terms of paperwork? Because as you said at the beginning of this was the last amphibious landing in the ETO. Have they got kind of one mind on the Pacific and Japan or something, or is it a long-term project that they're thinking about?
So all of the other Landing Craft Gun Medium are being prepared to be shipped out to the Far East.
Right.
The expectation is going to be used there. So there's this being a new weapon. This is the ideal time to test it and observe it. And yeah, the one thing that you spot in the Navy in their reports afterwards, every single report has recommendations in it. Even the skippers of individual craft will list in recommendations if they think there's any. This is drummed into all of the naval officers, always have an eye to the future and, you know, what can we learn from this operation. So even though it's sort of wrapping up to the end of the war, there's still this intention that useful lessons can be learned. So
we did the show with Andrew Whitmarsh. He's back again next week to do his part 2 of the landing craft type, so there'll be a little bit of content in there as well. But you know, obviously some of these types you mentioned earlier were developed for Overlord and the Bay of the Seine, and obviously they've still got them, so they may as well use them in this, which is now becoming the next amphibious thing. But then there's also this kind of next step thinking about the Far East. So it's like using stuff because they've got it in the arsenal, and also developing new stuff based on what hadn't been working. Because, you know, going back to Normandy, some of the various landing craft types obviously experienced a few teething problems, and some had been much better. So there's obviously been this kind of learning curve going on since June about what does work and what can be improved, which is it's nice to know that's the kind of position the Allies can be in by 44, when earlier they were just struggling to get anything anywhere to mount any kind of offensive, and now they can, we can actually improve this a little bit. It shows you where the Allies are getting to, but by this point of the war, the ability to really get these things as best as they possibly can be, rather than just making do that they were early in the war. Yeah,
absolutely. And yes, it's good to mention Normandy because that's actually the next slide, and this is where the weird name Support Squadron Eastern Flank actually comes from. So all of these vessels had been developed to support the landings on D-Day, basically beach saturation. But after the initial landings have been made, they don't really have an immediate role. So the intention was to put them to use, defending the anchorage against the expected attacks that were going to materialize from Le Havre, which is still in German hands right up until August, September sort of time. So after the initial landings, all of the landing craft gun, the landing craft flak that had been used on D-Day from Gold, Juno and Sword beaches were gathered up and deployed along the Trout line, which is that line just on the east side of Sword Beach, which is basically the edge of the anchorage and the front line facing Le Havre. And their role really was to defend the Trout line. They weren't alone. There were destroyers as well. There were motor torpedo boats on nightly deployments along that line as well. It was expected it was going to be very hot, and it was. There were almost nightly attacks by either S-boats or mini submarines or speedboats, or mines being floated down on the tide, that sort of thing. So that was where the origin of the name comes from, Support Squadron Eastern Flank, because they're guarding the eastern flank of the landing area, and that's the name that stuck. It's It's a weird name, and it's meaningless in the context of Walcheren, but it was still the official title that was being used by sellers and by all of the crews. In fact, they all addressed their reports to Commander, Support Squadron Eastern Flank, and so forth. So that's where they had been. They were withdrawn from Normandy after Le Havre fell, so they go back up to Poole in late August. And then basically they are the only immediately available support force available to Ramsay that he can employ for this operation. There's not enough destroyers to support it, and also the waters are very shallow off Walcheren, so destroyers can't get in very easily to get close to the coast. So really the Support Squadron Eastern Flank is the best available unit. They start their preparations. They soon find that they're going to get some help from this gentleman, James Moulton, the commander of 48 Commando. He had worked with the Support Squadron Eastern Flank previously during D-Day. I don't think he was overly happy with their liaison. So he then, on his own instigation, went and created a training memo for the Support Squadron Eastern Flank, because he anticipated that they would accompany him down the coast of Walcheren as they basically picked off all of these various batteries. And as he says in this memo, and I think I detect a little testiness in it, the arrangements were successful, but the built-up nature of our objective made it impossible to get full value out of it. So he comes up with this sort of training document to advise the Support Squadron Eastern Flank on how best to carry out their role to support them. And as you can see, he says there, these notes are intended to help you to help us. And he produced all sorts of drawings of the likely views that the Support Squadron would have of an enemy objective and how best to engage it while his troops move overland. I think the primary objective of this was to stop his troops coming under fire from the Support Squadron as they are bombarding the units, which is fair enough. And I can't remember who it is. I was searching for the reference earlier. I thought it was Moulton, but certainly there is one unit on D-Day that does get is very nearly hit by support fire from Landing Craft Flak, and they were very unhappy about it. It might have been Moulton, but I can't find the reference at the moment. Anyway, they are not, of course, the only unit that is supporting the operation on Walcheren, and it's important to touch upon this subject, which is the role of the RAF. And the fact that I forget how many, 247 Lancasters are about to bomb Westkapelle on the 3rd of October, whilst the Support Squadron Eastern Flank are preparing for their role. This happens on a space of about 2 hours on the 3rd of October. This is just after the Pathfinders have dropped their flares on the dyke, and you can see the coast there. You can also see Westkapelle, the village. Some of it has already been struck by some of those flares, so bombs are about to hit that corner of Westkapelle. And over the next 2 hours, in 5 waves, bombers pass over the coast and start to very heavily bomb the dyke. Within half an hour, the whole area is very badly cratered. You can see that corner of Westkapelle has suffered very heavily. Fortunately, there were leaflets dropped in advance to try and warn the population, but not everyone left, and quite a lot of people were killed in this bombing raid. Unfortunately, Westkapelle, the civilian casualties during the operation on Walcheren were 160 fatalities. Within an hour, there's more cratering. Another wave has come over. You can see the height of that shadow from the bomb blast right on the dyke just there. These are huge explosions that are starting to total this section of the dyke. And if you look at the corner there, just on the right, you can see the smoke all erupting from various craters. That's where the dyke is about to be breached. And yeah, within 2 hours of the bombing operation starting, the dyke has actually been completely obliterated, which is no small undertaking. I mean, that's very effective bombing by the RAF to so precisely strike the dyke sufficient to break it with enough bombs. Now, I say precisely, of course, you can see lots of other craters.
Yeah.
A lot of bombs don't hit the dyke, and they do unfortunately hit the town, but still enough bombs actually fall on the dyke to breach it like that. And later on in the afternoon, the 3rd of June, as high tide starts to hit, the land around there starts to flood. And the flooding goes eventually well beyond this photograph. And almost all of this area is underwater after a couple of weeks, in fact, because with each tide, the dyke gap gets bigger. As the water pours in and out, it stretches the boundaries of the dyke and creates this huge area of flooding. And Tobias mentioned this yesterday and the value of it, and it does have some value for the attackers. Later on, more bombing raids are carried out at 3 other locations on the coast, and very quickly, the vast majority of Walcheren, a good 75–80% of the land is flooded at high tide. Now, I've already looked at these coastal batteries, but there are other batteries. There's all sorts of defences along the coast and inland on Walcheren. 2 batteries, for instance, W10 and W14. These are beach batteries, so they're designed to be able to fire on beaches. But they are rapidly flooded. This is W14, just behind Westkapelle. You can see 2 bunkers there, which face out towards the sea on Westkapelle. And yeah, after the flooding, they are completely saturated and they are abandoned by the Germans, as are a lot of the defences on the stop lines, a lot of the bunkers inland, anti-airguns. The Germans can't use them because they're just too badly flooded. So what they do instead is remove the guns. And again, it was pointed out to me while I was in the Netherlands by my fantastic hosts, who observed that, they moved the guns to South Beveland instead. So they still employed them, but they were no longer useful in defence of Walcheren. How effective this flooding is debatable, because it does, of course, hold up the Allies and their advance as well. It makes the land impassable, not just to the Germans, but to the Allies as well. But certainly in the sense that it does flood quite a few of the inland batteries, it does help the landings, the initial landings, to a certain extent. But it is the coastal batteries themselves that are going to be the problem. This is W15, the one at Westkapelle, with British 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft guns in position. These ones are in open positions, although some were in enclosed positions, but they are still a threat to any landing, even if they're only 3.7-inch guns and not the 150 millimeters they're expected. They're still dangerous, and they are going to be a considerable problem for the landing at Westkapelle. So here's Westkapelle today. The dyke has been rebuilt, and this is how it looked on the 28th of October 1944. So that picture was taken 80 years ago yesterday. The gap in the dyke has got considerably bigger. The flooding is much worse. And this is another example of where I find that the planning seems to have been quite rushed. Having gone through all of the detail of the landings on D-Day and Sword Beach, you look through the orders documents for that, and it is so comprehensive. Every detail is very well dealt with, organized. Everything is correct. Everything agrees with everything else. One of the things I found going through the orders for Operation Infatuate II is the multitude of different details that don't always agree with each other or are done in different ways. So, for instance, the positioning of the beaches at Westkapelle is done in decimal degrees, minutes and decimal degrees, whereas all of the strong points that have to be targeted, all of the objectives, are done in military grids. So for some reason they decide to plot the beaches based off the position of the lighthouse at Westkapelle, which they actually position in the wrong place, and everything is then said, and the extent of Red Beach will be 1,100 yards at 245 degrees or something like that from the lighthouse, which is no help to anyone, really. Doesn't even work as a navigational aid if you're on the sea either. So this is how I managed to plot the actual extents of the 3 beaches at Westkapelle. So Red Beach to the north, Green Beach to the south, and White Beach in the middle. Red Beach and White Beach are the only ones that can be used on D-Day, with the intention that the landing craft will actually go into the gap in the dyke and land their buffaloes into the shallow waters once they get through the breach in the dyke. And you can see that gap has widened considerably in the 3.5 weeks since it was bombed, and there's more than enough space to get landing craft through. So the main assault force, the main group of landing craft tank, are going to go straight through there. And this is pretty much fundamental to how Sellers organised the Support Squadron Eastern Flank. And he left this very handy chart in his report that shows the layout, if you like, of how the operation was going to unfold. So using that and his orders documents, we can plot what was going to happen. The main assault force, the landing craft tank, is going straight up the middle, basically. To cover them, Sellers has split the Support Squadron Eastern Flank into 2 different groups, the Northern group and the Southern group. In each group, the landing craft rockets are going to fire their rockets from offshore, so they'll be at the back, if you like. Whereas the landing craft gun will go closer into the shore and then basically fan out and work their way north and south to bombard targets, strong points, bunkers, pillboxes, using their 4.7-inch guns. The landing craft flak have to get in much closer because of the shorter range nature of their weapons. They have to get within about 1,000 yards of the beach. That's 1 kilometer, which means that, yeah, they have to basically get much closer in the approach. They have to go much further forward. And of course, at the very vanguard of all of this are the landing craft gun medium, who are being supported by 3 landing craft support large on each flank. So on the north flank, landing craft gun medium 101, and on the south flank, landing craft gun medium 102. And each of them will have these 3 landing craft support. Remember, these are made of wood, with the 6-pounder Valentine tank turret on the bow to provide close support for them whilst they go in onto the beach to make their initial landing. So this is the situation on the morning of the 1st of November, or this is the plan, if you like. H hour is set for 9:45, which is a little after low tide, but already the assault is beset by problems. The spotter aircraft in the UK can't take off because of fog. Sound familiar? Yeah. And so Warspite, Erebus and Roberts are reduced to bombardment based on their own observations, which is never going to be as effective. They do bombard the strong points, they do make hits, but yes, their fire is not as accurate as it could be. Now, Sellers had anticipated that whatever happened, even if the spotter planes had managed to take off, their unit was still going to be the one that would do most of the engaging the enemy strong points. Now, he had realized something at D-Day, which he took with him on this operation. He found that German gunners tended to fire on vessels that are firing on them rather than juicier targets. So if there's 2 vessels out at sea, they will always target the vessel that is shooting at them rather than the landing craft carrying infantry in to land on the beach. And he was intending to use that basically to ensure that his vessels were drawing the fire of the German gunners, enabling the landing craft with the Royal Marines on board to get into the shore. And with the absence of the spotter planes for the bombardment force further out to sea, this is going to become even more vital. So very early on in the assault, the first vessels to really open fire after Warspite and Erebus have started their long-range bombardment are the landing craft rockets. And this is part of a video clip that was actually filmed from one of the landing craft, and that's one of the landing craft rockets launching one of its waves of rockets. So that white line in the middle is actually the blast of about 400 rockets launching up into the air. On the southern flank, this went reasonably well, but just as LCTR 363, I think, was firing, it was, no, sorry, 334 was the first in, and she launched her first salvo, but just as she was firing them, she was hit. And so she made an accidental launch and her shots went way off target. But then she was able to recover, straighten herself out, and she launched her second wave, pretty much on target, but was then bracketed by shells and quite badly damaged. She turns around and starts limping when she comes across her sister ship 363, which has also been struck by shells, having just fired her rockets and is actually disabled. And so 334 has to take 363 in tow and extract her from the firing area. Now, she had probably been hit by W13, this strong point a little bit south of Westkapelle, a little bit further down the coast, with the 150mm guns. And those guns will, in fact, engage targets amongst the support squadron almost all day. And it's estimated that that battery accounts for half of the losses amongst the support squadron Eastern Flank. It's not until it's neutralized much later in the day by 48 Royal Marine Commando that gunfire from there finally ceases. On the north flank, the landing craft rockets is almost disastrous. The one LCTR that gets its rockets off properly is 331, which is commanded by William Golding, the famous author who wrote Lord Flak. He made several observations in his report. He noted that his bridge didn't have a cover, an armored cover to protect them from the effect of the rockets launching. Now, he'd previously been dubious about this, but actually in the event, he said that having the freedom of movement and the freedom of an open bridge outweighed the negatives of the blast from the rockets when they launched. But he did observe that, in his words, breathing is inadvisable during the launch and beards shouldn't be worn, which rather alarms me to think that the rockets are going to be that close that they could singe your beard. Anyway, he manages to get his rockets off at the appropriate range, and they come down in the rough vicinity of his target, which is W15, that German strongpoint with the British 3.7 heavy anti-aircraft guns. But the other two landing craft rockets, 378, 457, they seem to have some problem, and it looks like it's potentially that the radar operators on board struggled to identify the coastline on their radar because of all of the ships ahead of them, the landing craft gun, the landing craft flak, and the landing craft tanks themselves. They were distorting the readings on their radar sets, which made it difficult to work out what their exact range to the coast was, because they need to be positioned very precisely. You can't aim these rockets. They have a fixed range, and you need to make sure that you are at that range in order to hit your target. Now, that target being the coast means that you have to be very precise. And they got it wrong. And they launched their rockets from too far out, with the net result that the rockets came down into the sea amongst the landing craft gun and landing craft flak as they were deploying closer to the shore. Lieutenant Cheney on landing craft gun 2 was livid because his ship is suddenly surrounded by rockets that come down into the sea all around him and on his deck. One strikes one of the guns, a splinter from one cuts the artery on one of his crew on the bridge. He was only just saved by the medical officer by the skin of his teeth with a tourniquet. In his report, he is incensed. And this is days after the operation, but the level of anger in his report, and he says whoever was responsible should be found, and if it is through dereliction of duty, they should be court-martialed. And somebody has written in pencil next to his report, correct, which might have been Sellers, I'm not sure. But yeah, clearly people were very unhappy about this because these rockets all came down amongst the landing craft themselves. Fortunately, without severe casualties, as far as I can tell, nobody appears to have been killed by these rockets, but basically they fail in their operation and they withdraw, having not managed to achieve anything. But next in, basically leading the vanguard now, are the next group of vessels, and these are the landing craft gun medium, 101 on the north and 102 to the south. 101 in the north is going to attack Red Beach, and she's been given 2 targets, these pillboxes just visible on the shore here. Now, this is again where I can't help but feel the short time frame that they had to plan things, and probably the very small planning staff that Pugsley had at his disposal means that there's errors and issues creep in. This is one of the targets. This is a German bunker, W267. You can see it very clearly there. It housed a 75mm anti-tank gun, a French gun. You can see that the pillbox has the curtain, if you like, the protecting flanking wall on the north side. And it's quite obvious from this photograph that that gun position faces north. Yeah. There is an open gun pit just beneath it, which faces south. And in fact, when some observers visited this a couple of days after the landings, there's the 75mm gun, and the gun had been wheeled out into that open pit. But on the day of the landing itself, the gun was inside the casemate. All of the reports agree on that. But the observers who went along to it did question why this had been a target in the first place, given that it faced north and did not face towards the landings. And this again seemed, they said in all of the aerial photos, it's quite clear this faces north. And there's clearly some bewilderment on their part that this was chosen as a target. Anyway, there's the gun position, the bunker down at the bottom.
Yeah.
The Landing Craft Gun 101 had a secondary target, which was those pillboxes up there, which do not appear on intelligence maps. But you can see there's two of them, and you can see the one closest to us does actually face south. So that is a more dangerous target because that does fire onto the landing area, onto Red Beach. Nonetheless, on the day of the landing itself, and this picture is from about the same time, 101 comes in onto the beach under the command of Lieutenant Flammonk, the skipper. And according to all of the reports filed by all of the officers who were on board afterwards, they beached right in front of the bunker, W267. And the distances that they give are anywhere between 30 and 50 yards. So there's a discrepancy of 20 yards or 20 meters, but whatever way you look at it, that is very, very, very close. That's practically point blank range. So she probably came ashore pretty much where that blue circle is and starts engaging that gun position. As I said, observers visited afterwards, and this is the view that they would have had from the sea. For scale, one of the officers is on the right.
Great photo.
It's fantastic. And you can see the damage that has been caused to that flanking wall, the buttress, if you like, by these 17-pounder shells. You can see they've really creamed the outer face of the wall off, and they've exposed all of the reinforcing steel bars that pass through it. But unfortunately, the observers noted that wall is 10 feet thick. Now, some of the armor-piercing shells that they observed, they could shove a stick in and they could feel the shell, and with a torch they could actually see the backs of some of these solid steel shells. They were about 5 feet embedded into the wall. But yeah, it's just not enough.
It's fascinating because, as someone like myself who's looked at way too many Normandy photos post-invasion when they're being hit by 5-inch shells and 8-inch shells from naval guns, that a 17-pounder has done more than that, but still not enough. I mean, it's done considerably more, but on the inside of the wall, relatively little damage. Although the hearing of anybody inside that might be affected, but it's getting better, but it's still not actually achieving what it's supposed to. And I also want, before I let you continue again, I'm wondering how much updated information they had about the Atlantic wall positions. In the great database they'd have had about that would have been in the collecting of the stuff back in, I guess, even in 43 for the entire, Norway down to Spain. And I wonder how much they've done in the way of updating it kind of since June, because you said, this has been fairly hastily put together, because we know that Videstonsness get rejigged, and strong points, the open emplacements get replaced by covered emplacements, and the angle of guns get changed. I wonder whether it's just a case of just not been updated enough.
Yeah, it's hard to tell in this instance, and it's interesting that they've targeted a gun that clearly faces north and isn't a threat to the landing area, this gun doesn't appear to have fired. It's hard to know really how much they learned from Normandy that influenced what happens here. And I think, to be honest, with the short planning time, they just didn't have the time to plan in that level of detail. Potentially, I'm supposing, I suppose, in a way there, but yeah, it's an interesting experiment that they've conducted here, but the target really wasn't worth the attention. What it did do, though, the three gunners who were inside did eventually crack and ran out the back door, and they were cut down by machine gun fire from some of the landing craft coming in on White Beach. But yes, this was never a threat to anyone. But what was a threat to the landing craft was that bunker further up the coast, the one at the top there, and that was pouring fire into landing craft gun medium 101. Now, the range of, or the angle of fire of that gun, it would appear it could only actually hit the stern of the landing craft gun medium. There's this fantastic model of one in the Imperial War Museum collection, which helps me sort of demonstrate what was happening on board. And I've used this while I've been writing the account of 101 to figure out where people are and all of the different rooms on board. As I said, there's an armored citadel, if you like, inside the ship. So that section in red is armored. That controls the, covers the engines and the magazines for the two turret guns. And the ammunition is passed up through hatches from below decks directly into the turrets through grilled floors. And so that's how they're able to keep supplying the guns. The skipper and the officer commanding the Royal Marines, Commander Tuffin, that was his name, they are in that little armoured citadel on the deck below the open bridge, commanding what's happening. So there's nobody on deck, because they would be mown down by machine gun fire if they were. And the machine gun fire is getting increasingly heavy as it starts targeting the ship. So the gunners in the two turrets report the constant pinging of machine gun bullets whacking away at them. And then they start to hit their periscopes and even the sighting slits, which are only very tiny little narrow slits to look out through. Bullets start coming through there and pinging around inside the turrets, and then striking the deck beneath the turrets and ricocheting back up into the turret. And in B turret, which is the one closest to us on this model, the one at the back, on the port side of the vessel, two of the crew are incapacitated by ricocheting bullets, and they have to be lowered down into the magazine because they can't risk taking them out of the back door onto the deck because the weight of machine gun fire is too heavy. Meanwhile, a somewhat heavier caliber gun is striking the stern of the landing craft. It doesn't seem to be able to hit the armored citadel bit, or it can't traverse its gun enough, it's unclear, and peppering it with holes. And after about 9 minutes, they land just before H hour. They land at 9:41, according to Flamank's report. Flamand realizes that they need to get off the beach because both the gun turrets have become incapacitated to a certain extent through the injuries to the crews. The right-hand gun, the recoil mechanism is struck by machine gun bullets and stops working, so that the crew actually have to push the gun out by hand because the recoil spring has failed. And it quickly becomes evident to Flamand they need to go back out, get out of the line of fire, and try and regroup and then go in again. So he orders his first lieutenant, Lieutenant Damon, Sub-Lieutenant Damon, to take the kedge party out onto the aft deck. And the aft deck is that bit back there, to wind the kedge anchor in, basically, to help pull them off the beach. And this is an incredibly dangerous place to be. And Flamand notes in his report that he detected that Damon knew that this was a suicide mission. And indeed it was. And of the three men who go out, they are all struck by machine gun bullets. Damon is killed immediately. And one of the stokers who is with him, Deverell, crew members who was with him, Deverell is also very badly injured, mortally in fact. And Stoker Richmond, who has gone out with them, is injured in the legs. And he manages to drag himself back into the cabin space. When a party goes out later, Damon is already dead, but they retrieve Deverell and they pull him into the officers' heads, the officers' toilet, basically, which I've squared in yellow just there, just back in the corridor, where he eventually succumbs to his wounds. Nonetheless, by emptying the buoyancy tanks, they're able to get the vessel off the beach and withdraw. The observer from Combined Operations Headquarters, Commander Scott Miller, goes out to deal with the kedge anchor. He finds that they can just they can jettison the kedge anchor and just undo the cable in that way. So they're no longer trapped on the beach by the kedge. They just let it go and they pull out into deeper water. But very quickly they realize that they're taking on water. Now, this has all happened within the space of about 9 minutes, because at the same time as they're carrying out this operation, the landing craft infantry carrying 41 Commando are landing just next to them on the edge of Red Beach. And we see them in this photograph. They're there on the left. They're cutting across this image. There's a shell, probably from Warspite or Rodney, just exploding around WN15. Those are the landing craft infantry. And if they're just cutting across there, then in this picture we can make out on the left, that red circle, that's almost certainly the German bunker 267. On the right is another feature that we can use to work out where we are. That's the remains of a windmill that was destroyed in the bombing. And that means where I've circled in blue, that looks like it's a vessel. And the only vessel it could be really is Landing Craft Gun Medium 101 still on the beach. Potentially anyway. But when the landing craft infantry come ashore, they've probably been ashore for 5 or 10 minutes by the time this photograph is taken. There's only 3 masts visible there, which are the 3 masts of the landing craft infantry. So 101 has retracted by now. But there's our German bunker. And there are commandos from 41 Commando already making their way over to basically occupy it. And so, whether 101... whether it was necessary to attack that bunker or not, what it did at least prevent was the gun from being wheeled out into the open pit behind this bunker and engaging any targets, because they were pounding that bunker so much that there was no way the gun crew were going to try and wheel the gun out on the other side. So they definitely had an effect. They definitely helped support that side of the landings. But it was going to cost them quite dearly. Because the number of holes peppering the stern meant that they hadn't got very far out to sea, less than a mile, and they realized they were going down by the stern. So Flank ordered all of the crew up on the deck. At this point, we can actually identify some of the people on board. So up on the bridge, you can see the officer in shirt and tie. That can only be Commander Scott Miller, because one of the other officers' reports by Commander Peretz, he noted that Scott Miller appeared the day before they were due to sail and came on board, and he was the only person who was wearing full dress uniform. So that's definitely him. He's also visible in the left of this photo. You can see him again in dress uniform as the crew start to abandon ship. And at this point, one of the support landing crafts, 510, comes alongside and starts picking up some of the crew. But it's too dangerous to go alongside. You can see 101 is already keeling over to port now. The crew all abandon the vessel, and then 101 capsizes. Some of the crew can actually walk on the deck and onto the side of the hull as it turns turtle, and then jump into the water. And they're all picked up by some of the other landing craft. Somewhat unbelievably, there's only 2 fatalities on board. Sub-Lieutenant Damon, the first lieutenant, and Deverell, who succumbs to his wounds after he'd been dragged into the officers' heads. Several wounded men on board, Richmond and some of the gunners, but they are all picked out of the water. So despite the hell that they have just endured at point-blank range on a beach, there's the number of casualties is remarkably light.
Which is kind of worth reflecting on, despite the harrowing nature of the story you told us. When we boil this all down to the essential need to get that Scheldt estuary open and to seize Walcheren and do all that, at the before this, the planners would have taken 2 or 3 fatalities to get, okay, we can't confirm exactly how much impact it had against those German defenses, but it's not a huge loss rate to gain a potentially large advantage of knocking out that gun.
No, it's acceptable, but it's not the norm, as we'll see in a little bit. Again, it's just worth reflecting on the planning for this operation. So there's 101's target in yellow. W267, German bunker, 75mm anti-tank gun. However, that position is given 3 different numbers in different documents. It's 268 in another document, it's 269 in another. The strong point is positioned here in 2 different reports. And it's only really, I think, fortunate that in the final naval orders that are issued, their targets are these 2 grid squares, which are accurately positioning the two German bunkers. It was not quite the same for Landing Craft Gun 102, which is attacking on the southern side, and here she is, quite possibly just before the landings. It's hard to date this picture, but that does look to be 101 just ahead of her, and that could well be Walcheren in the background. It's uncertain, but that is definitely 102. So some of the targets that she's given are one of the naval documents, or one of the strong point lists, positions a bunker right there where there is no bunker visible on the defense overlay or on aerial photographs or any photograph I've managed to see of this bit of the beach. Another document says that it was going to target this bunker right here, and in fact this is the one that the inspectors then went and visited, except they couldn't quite visit it because it's this bunker which was flooded at high tide and completely inaccessible. Right. And it's a personnel bunker. There's no offensive weaponry on it. It's still there. It's exposed at spring low tides off the beach, so you could paddle out to it if you wanted and stand on the roof of it. But this wasn't her target because it doesn't have any offensive capabilities, and it was pretty much in the middle of the gap at this stage. The final naval orders for Operation Infatuate II give her 2 targets in these 2 grid squares where again there are no visible German defences. Immediately above the right hand square there are some open anti-aircraft emplacements, but even so that grid square is in the wrong place. I eventually have managed to work out that her target was this bunker over here. Right. And this is what I'm saying about this 6-week preparation phase. You don't see this level of inconsistency in the D-Day orders. You do see some minor inconsistencies, but nothing quite like this. And this is significant because this is a target. This is a specific objective that one vessel is going to go for. It's given different code numbers: 266, 269, 268. There's a serious lack of consistency in a lot of these documents, unfortunately. And I think,
and you combine that photo you showed from the bow of the ship with this thin strip of coastline earlier, is that navigation is absolutely key to this, isn't it? I mean, we talk about, when you're standing on Omaha Beach or something, for example, you can't imagine that it's hard to see from the coast. Then you go out a few miles, and even with its cliffs and bluffs, it becomes hard to see. But this is apart from the lighthouse and the odd church tower, this is a tiny little thin strip of green between the blue and the sea and the grey of the sky, and yet they're getting duff information in advance. So you've got to navigate yourself to the right place, but it's not even the right place anyway.
And they're very hard to spot. So the bunker it's targeting is there on the left. So the building on the far left is the radar station, and then just below it in the sand dune you can see the black box, if you like. That's a German bunker with a 47mm gun fitted in it, and here it is in slightly closer detail. And this was the clue that happily made my mind up for me. It says pillbox shown in photo number 5, the previous photograph, 47mm gun in ball and socket embrasure, some damage from small caliber guns. This is small caliber in the sense that there's 15-inch shells being fired, but the small caliber guns that gunfire they're referring to is 6-pounder and 17-pounder. So the 17-pounder is Landing Craft Gun Medium 102, and the 6-pounders are the 3 Landing Craft Support. So that is the target. It makes way more sense, but it's just so odd that the orders and the lists of targets are all so inconsistent in that regard.
Willie Robertson asked what size the grid squares are on your maps, Just
I think they're 100 foot.
Okay.
On that particular one, yeah.
Thank you.
So this is one of the landing craft support large, and this looks to be 256, which was actually one of the vessels attacking that bunker, except Michael Sabali, who's very active on World War II forum for anyone who uses that, expert on landing craft, very knowledgeable chap, has worked out that that's not 256. And if you look at the 6 very carefully, it's clearly been doctored. And it is in fact 257. Somebody has doctored that picture for reasons unknown. Anyway, that's by the by. 256 and the other 2 landing craft support were there to back up 102. But as they got close to the shore, they came under very heavy fire from all of these other positions, including the anti-aircraft gun positions. The 2 leading vessels, 252 and 258. 258 was hit very early and burst into flames, and 252 of the flotilla leader aboard came alongside to try and rescue survivors. But they didn't get very far before they were hit themselves, and the 2 vessels sank very quickly after bursting into flames. So 102 probably came in on this rough track, having followed the main assault wave in, beaches in front of that strong point. Whilst the landing craft support are trying to rescue survivors off of the 2 burning ones, 102 comes into the beach. Observers saw that she was on fire before she landed, and then the fire was seen to go out, and but then it seemed to start up again, and she was last seen backing off, and then nobody is quite sure exactly where she sank, although I have now spoken to a diver who has located the wreck, so we can pinpoint that she did come off the beach, but ablaze. Those other 2 vessels then, 252 and 258, were probably in this vicinity. I'm estimating roughly where they are in this until I get more information, but 258 is ablaze, 252 comes alongside to rescue survivors, but then 252 is struck as well, and they both sink. Whilst 256 has gone to try and lay a smoke screen to protect them during this rescue operation, but she is hit in her steering gear and starts going around in circles, and she is then struck whilst off the beach. All 3 of the landing craft support large and landing craft gun medium sink. There are no survivors from 102. There are no survivors from 252. There is 1 survivor from 258. And there are about 15 survivors from 256. So this is a very, very heavy loss of life. Basically, 95 men are lost in this very, very short action. And I showed you these folders earlier. This is the folder I have for 101 of all of the different reports that were filed and all of the different documents, the observer reports, that sort of thing. This is what I have for 102. There's just nothing. There's no survivor statements. There's no recommendations for decorations. There's no reports. And it's quite telling. And every time I open this folder and see the empty 102 folder, I sort of wince to myself. It's appalling, really. And the survivors from 256 were only rescued by one of the landing craft personnel who went in quite close to the shore under smoke to pick them up. The survivor from 258 was rescued by 252, but then escaped that with a handful of other people in a raft. They all succumbed to their injuries, and he's eventually picked up near Breskens, having drifted for quite a long way down into the Scheldt. So the loss of life on the southern side, in contrast to what's happening on the north side, is very, very heavy. Meanwhile, the landing craft gun are in action. So they have deployed on the north and south flanks of the beach, and they come in for, again, very heavy fire. On the south side, am I starting on the south side? I think I'm starting on the south side. They are bringing their 4.7-inch guns to bear, but they come in for very heavy fire as well. Landing craft gun 10, let's see how this is quite similar to the picture I showed you earlier. Landing craft gun 10 received a direct hit just behind B gun which killed several of the crew, including the Sergeant Major of the Royal Marines, and hit some of the ready-use ammunition lockers. And burning cordite then went ablaze, and it took some time to put it out. So that's what you can see there. That's just after a direct hit, probably from W13 again, that strong point a little bit further down the coast. She eventually manages, or the crew eventually managed to get that fire under control, and she then re-engages, but she's been very severely damaged. There are several hits on the hull, and yes, part of the tank deck has been gutted by that fire. Landing Craft Gun 11, also on the south flank. She, quite early on in the operation, takes a hit on the bridge, and then another on the wireless room, that incapacitates all of the officers on board. The commander of the Royal Marines, the one of the observers, the battery liaison officer, and the skipper is very badly wounded in the abdomen. So the only officer still alive on board, who had been down below deck when the shell struck, was the first officer, Sub-Lieutenant John Frederick Smith, who later changed his name to John Jarvis Smith, became quite a famous shipbroker. After Lieutenant Foggett, the skipper, had been injured, he comes up on the bridge and takes command of the vessel. He manages to regain control of it after the bridge has been trashed by these shells, and then steers it off to one of the rescue ships. This is the same rescue ship that's just picked up survivors from Landing Craft Gun 101, and the injured are transferred. And he then brings the Landing Craft back into operation, engaging targets on the south side. But again, it's a vessel that's been very badly damaged, with quite a large loss of life amongst the crew on board. And it's interesting that even Smith himself is thought to have been killed in the operation, and that therefore there were no officer survivors. But he later spots, or I think it's his wife or a friend points out to him that in the Gazette he is listed as killed in action, and then makes the necessary inquiries to remind people he is in fact still alive, which is where this fascinating letter, His Majesty the King is glad to hear that Sub-Lieutenant John F. Smith, RNVR, is alive again. He is reborn. So yes, his action then changed, basically. Rather than getting a mention in dispatches, he was awarded the DSC instead of the posthumous, illegal posthumous mention in dispatches that he was going to receive. Meanwhile, Landing Craft Gun 2 up on the north flank, the one that had just been bracketed by rockets, comes in for very heavy fire from W15, the German strongpoint with the 3.7-inch guns. And this creates a nuisance for the landing craft all day. And herself has to be rescued after her engines are struck by one of the landing craft tanks that is returning from the beach, having just offloaded its buffers. That's LCT 789, seen here in the Solent, just waiting to go to Sword Beach on D-Day. 789, and in fact, many of the landing craft returning from the beach take the opportunity to assist the landing craft of the Support Squadron Eastern Flank as they're trying to extract themselves. The Landing Craft Flak equally come in for very rough treatment because they had to get so much closer to the beach, within 1,000 yards, so that they could actually use their main armament. And Landing Craft Flak 32, seen here just before D-Day, is accompanied by Landing Craft Flak 37 as they go in on the south side, when 37 is hit amidships and a magazine explodes and the entire vessel bursts into flames and then grounds on one of the sandy shoals just offshore and is gutted by fire. 32 then proceeds to try and engage all of the other targets that have been allotted to both of them, and spends a lot of time leading quite a charmed life, actually. I forget the skipper's name, Lieutenant Elliot, I think it is, manages to steer it out of harm's way and then back into the danger zone, constantly engaging targets as it goes up and down this beach. Later on in the morning, she is redeployed to the north because there's barely any vessels left on the north side to try and escort in 47 Flotilla, who are bringing in 47 Commando. a little bit later in the landings. And she, as a result, steams straight up to the north side and then goes right across the bows of 47 flotilla, cutting right across in front of them, and steams up the shoreline less than 1,000 yards off the beach, engaging W-15, the German strongpoint, with the British heavy anti-aircraft guns. And in fact, the flotilla leader of 47 flotilla noted this and said LCF-32 then steamed right across our bows and opened fire with everything she had on the 4 gun emplacements which were firing on us. Their courage and resource was most heartening to us and undoubtedly saved my group from coming under much heavier fire than we did. All concerned feel greatly indebted to 32 for their grand work, and several of the commandos, in fact, noticed this as well and comment much the same thing, that they were saved by this Landing Craft Flak that suddenly steamed across in front of them and took all of these guns under fire with its much smaller caliber weaponry. And in fact, it did keep the German gunners' heads down. They ceased firing whilst these flak guns are firing at them. And it's not until 32 comes to the end of her run and then turns around that the gunners can then poke their heads up again. They engage 32, and so she starts to come under fire. And she carries on in this way for a couple more hours until Sellers orders her to withdraw, seeing that she's coming under heavier and heavier fire. But she's done the vital work. Again, she's taken the fire off of the 47 flotilla, who managed to land all of their forces quite intact. As they withdraw back over to the main position offshore, out of range of the German guns, the crew count up all of the holes in the hull and the deck and everything. They found 47 shell holes.
Wow.
Eventually in the afternoon, her engines give up and she has to be towed back to Ostend, but very significant, very effective little vessel in that sense, to be honest. And this is how the landings go on, really. By 12:30, so less than 3 hours after H hour, there's only 4 vessels still in operation: Landing Craft Gun 9, Landing Craft Gun 10, and 2 of the Landing Craft Support, 254 and 259. Out of a force of originally 27 vessels, only 4 are actually operational to the extent that they can provide any fire support. The rest, if they can still move, they are laying smoke, maybe. Excuse me. They're employed laying smoke or towing some of the others out of harm's way, basically. But in the main, the assault force has been largely incapacitated. But they've managed to achieve what they set out to do. The commandos managed to get ashore. 41 commando are all ashore quite quickly with a minimum of casualties. They start to tackle the German strongpoints. By about 12:30, they're attacking strongpoint W-15 from the rear. They tackle some of the other German strongpoints. They neutralize, or rather 10 inter-allied commando, I think, who are with them, neutralize the spotters in the lighthouse. You can see in the background of that picture. So they've achieved what they set out to do because they've managed to make it possible for the assault forces, for the commandos and for the armored vehicles to get ashore. And if it hadn't been for them basically pulling all of that German fire to themselves rather than letting them target the landing craft, then it's highly unlikely that the commandos would have got ashore. The weight of fire that was directed at Support Squadron Eastern Flank, if it had been directed at the landing craft, who have no guns to defend themselves with, other than a couple of 20mm Orlikans at the stern, they wouldn't have stood a chance.
And in your research, Stephen, have you found any kind of references to the fact that perhaps back in Overlord there'd been heavier losses on the beaches than they were expecting, and they were trying to kind of offset beach casualties specifically by, as you said, they're sending in these gunboats to take fire to get more infantry ashore, or is it just, you know, is there a direct link, but do you think, between those two experiences?
There is, there are in some ways, yeah. I mean, certainly the landings on D-Day were much better supported with, you know, a much wider range of vessels. Destroyer support obviously helped a great deal, and they just weren't available for this operation. Had there been destroyers and had there been deep enough water to get them in close, I think it would have made quite a difference. And perhaps the support squadron wouldn't have been as badly mauled as it was. But because they were all that was available, they were the only vessels that could be brought to bear on the enemy targets, other than Warspite and the 2 monitors offshore.
Yeah.
Who don't have the accuracy. Spotter planes don't start appearing until the middle of the day, by which point Support Squadron Eastern Flank is spent, and it's about 3-4 in the afternoon that they finally withdraw, because they realize they haven't got anything left to provide. Sellers looks at his force and realizes there's nothing more that they can do. So this is one of my research documents. This is how I compile all of my information, for those of you who wonder. So there's a spreadsheet that lists every vessel in this landing, and down the left are the vessel names. Basically, those in red were sunk. Those in pinky orange, were incapacitated or badly damaged to the point that they could no longer fulfill their function. So you can see there's only a couple of vessels untouched. Most of those, I mean, 2 of them are Landing Craft rocket, and they can't do much after they fired their rockets. 2 Landing Craft support from the northern group, and 1 Landing Craft gun from the southern group. That's all that could do anything. The one in yellow, Landing Craft Rocket 457, she was sunk a couple of days later by a mine. But basically, out of that force of 27 vessels, on the morning of the 1st of November, 9 were sunk and 10 were badly damaged. So, 2/3 of the force has become, of the ships, if you like, have become casualties. Now, it's how we describe losses of ships as casualties. They're sunk or incapacitated. If we look at the human loss of life, then that is also very, very significant. And this is all taken from the Army Operational Research Group report into the landings. And there's quite a bit of information here, but the main rows to look at are the top row, the support squadron crews. Out of a total strength of 1,030 men, they took a total of nearly 300 casualties, 297. And of those, 172 were fatal. In fact, there's more men killed, 172, than there are wounded, 125. Although I question that figure, because I've seen another one that suggests 250 or so were wounded, which might be more realistic. I don't know. I need to do a bit more digging into that. But either way, that's a percentage of their strength of nearly 30%. So nearly 1/3 of the people deployed from the Support Squadron Eastern Flank become casualties, which is a huge, huge percentage. If you look at the total naval casualties, including the Landing Craft tank crew, the Landing Craft infantry crew, motor launch crew, and a couple of the shore parties, the figures are even higher. 183 fatalities, essentially all on D-Day on the 1st of November, and a total of 350 casualties, killed and wounded. Contrast that with the Army figures, and this is for 8 days of fighting, not just D-Day, but the campaign to then take the rest of the island. And they don't lose as many men killed. They only have a total of 125 men killed in 8 days of fighting, compared to 183 men killed in the Navy just on one day, one morning, essentially. That's a huge difference. And this bucks the trend, because normally in an amphibious operation, the infantry will suffer higher casualties in the subsequent fighting. But the fact that the Royal Navy lose more men killed in one morning than the land forces, a brigade of commandos, 41, 47, 48 commando, the tank crews, the Royal Engineers, the medical units, only take 125 casualties by comparison. It's a shocking disparity, really, and that shows the significance of the fighting. And yes, the vast majority of those naval casualties are from the Support Squadron Eastern Flank.
Again, I'm wondering, Stephen, whether there is a conscious effort to kind of minimize commando casualties, because I mean, we could go back the whole fact that the commando brigade are left on the high ground in Normandy for weeks, rather than sort of go in and get out again. So they're incurring casualties, weeks after June the 6th, and and that's not that's only Normandy, going back to Dieppe and things like that. Whether they're thinking, Christ, those guys have been through the ringer now for 3 or 4 years. We need to give them a little bit more of a head start. I mean, is that part of the thinking? I'm wondering, because their commanders have taken heavy casualties for a long time.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything about that yet, so I can't say that there's any report or anything that would state that, but I've still got more reading to do. But it's an interesting point, because what's different about this operation to D-Day is that this commando force is put ashore on D-Day itself, on the 1st of November. They're on their own. Unlike D-Day, where you land your assault force and then for the next 3 months you're loading more men onto the beach every single day and building up your huge army. That doesn't happen here. They put 4th Special Service Brigade and the assisting Royal Engineer and armoured units ashore, and that's it. That's all that's landing. There's no follow-up force. There's no replenishments coming. There was an anticipation of landing supplies over the next couple of days and evacuating the wounded by landing craft, of course, but the weather then interfered, and even that became very challenging, and it was several days before the wounded could even be evacuated. Once they were ashore, it was just them. So it would make sense that there would be a conscious effort to minimize the infantry casualties as much as possible, because once they're ashore, they're it. And if you lose all of them on day one, then yeah, you're in very serious trouble.
And so, I guess this is in the peak of the manpower shortage within infantry units, just generally, isn't it? This is the Canadian Army is struggling, the British Army is struggling. Whereas I'm guessing that there aren't necessarily those same shortages in the Royal Navy at this point. They're coming through the trade schools. They're coming through I don't know. I'm throwing that out there, but certainly there's definitely a shortage of infantry across the all theaters, isn't there? So
yeah, that's true. It seems plausible, even if it wasn't deliberate, that perhaps there's a sort of,
it just comes into the thinking kind of unconsciously almost.
So anyway, at Westkapelle today, of course, the dyke has been rebuilt. There's the memorial to the landings up on the tank, up on the top of the dyke of one of the tanks that was actually there. And the memorial commemorates the whole landing. There are several plaques all around it to different units and that sort of thing. But it's a tank, and there's carvings of the Marines. For the landing craft, there's this quite famous picture of one of the crab flails coming ashore, an LCT 737 in the background, and as a sort of form of commemoration, this Dutch landing craft assault has been given the badge LCT 737. This is a post-war landing craft, but that's the small tribute to the landing craft. But that's about it, to be honest. And I do think, I think it would be nice for better recognition for Support Squadron Eastern Flank for the role that they played in getting the infantry ashore. I think a more dedicated memorial of some sort. It doesn't have to be there. It could be in this country, to be honest. A new memorial was only just unveiled outside the National Museum of the Royal Navy a few weeks ago to HMS Royal Oak. And the Support Squadron Eastern Flank played such a pivotal role in this landing, and this was such a pivotal operation in opening up the Scheldt, which was absolutely pivotal in the rest of the war in Northwest Europe, in allowing Antwerp to function, which had we not got Antwerp online, you really need to think about the effect that would have had on the rest of the war, especially because the first ships get into Antwerp on, I think it's the 28th of November. And what happens only a few weeks later? Battle of the Bulge. How would that be different if we didn't have Antwerp, if we were still bringing the vast majority of our supplies from the Normandy beaches on the Red Ball Express? So there's a lot to think about in terms of what actually happens on Walcheren on the 1st of November up until the 8th of November, but also its impact on the rest of the war. And I will leave you with that thought.
Well, I mean, it's amazing considering you're only part way through your research. Yeah, I'm not. I'm surprised this isn't, after publication of the book. I mean, Christ knows what you're going to find out later on. We have a few questions that are most of them you've kind of addressed as you've gone along. But Sean Bennon is one of the few who asked what would the targets for Warspite and the monitors have been if the spotting aircraft had been able to assist with the landings.
I will tell you that in 2 seconds. Hang on, because I have the fleet orders in front of me, and they would have targeted naval bombardment. Prearranged targets would have been W17, W19, and W5 for Warspite.
Right.
So these are the batteries on the north side and one of the inland ones. Erebus would have been targeting W15, the one next to Westkapelle, and W11 if necessary, which is further down the shore, basically. Roberts was going to be targeting much smaller individual bunkers within larger resistance nests, shall we say, so collections of collections of bunkers arranged in a strong point ringed by barbed wire and trenches. W154, which was, I think, the radar station, and W285, which was further inland. So they did have set targets, but yeah, because they then were trying to observe purely from their mast top without the best view, it was much harder to actually identify those targets.
Brilliant. Another question which has come up in this week generally about whether or not the whole Scheldt campaign could have been brought ahead earlier. So from your point of view, looking at the elements you've researched so far, Robert asked earlier, were the amphibious forces available if attack had been made in early to mid-September? So you said that, the commandos kind of go back from Normandy end of August, early September. You said that although Le Havre wasn't liberated until September the 12th, you said a lot of the specialized landing craft are kind of back at the end of August. So from your point of view, could this have been launched earlier on a sheer kind of is it available basis?
It's an interesting question. It is one I've been considering lately as well. Yeah, it's Support Squadron Eastern Flank were only withdrawn in late August. They do need a period of refit and resupply. The crews need a break more than anything. But they're brought pretty much into use in mid-September. And then, like I said, they only have 6 weeks of planning time. And I do wonder if there was time to do all of the necessary planning if they tried to launch the operation sooner. I mean, what they certainly could have done is started the landward advance faster, and if they'd cut off South Beveland earlier and prevented German reinforcements from moving in and out, then that would have made a huge difference. But as it is, the land campaign, which sort of starts on the 2nd of October, I think, with Switchback and Vitality. If they'd started them a little bit earlier, yes, but it would be harder to plan the amphibious operation. It does need some preparation time. It does need those landing craft. The landing craft that were pulled out for the operation, the army were pissed, let's put it that way, because they were being taken off of the resupply work that was so vital to getting supplies to their frontline units, the build-up, basically. By culling landing craft from that force, and 4 flotillas is no small amount. They're reducing the amount of supplies that can be carried over the English Channel to Normandy or to ports like Boulogne or Calais or Ostend was in use by now. The army didn't want to give up any berths in Ostend for this assault force, because again it took away berths from their resupply vessels who were bringing them ammunition and men and so forth. So just getting the landing craft is not that straightforward, and I wonder how much earlier it could have been done for the amphibious operation at any rate. Certainly the land campaign could have started a bit sooner.
I mean, that's a good answer anyway. And as we've been discussing with this, is that with Phil Blood talking about Aachen, this whole October Antwerp, Aachen, Arnhem conundrum that we're faced with now of whether the resources were used in the right order and in the right focus, and which offend that these are a whole raft of questions that will that can keep us awake for the next 20 or 30 years. Not just how did Market Garden go wrong, but could there have been a different plan? Could there have been a different focus? It comes down again to Eisenhower and Montgomery and options. But it's a really fascinating period, that October time, when the Allies have options available to them, and now we can look and say, and it's all speculation, whether or not the option they went for could have been done differently, or a different order, or more focus. It's fascinating to think about.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the reasons the army needs all this resource is because, of course, they've gone for this Operation Market Garden, which requires sudden influx of supply. But then also, after Market Garden has failed or succeeded, however you want to look at it, they now have a new front line that is, I don't know, 10 times longer than it would have been if they didn't have this finger pushing up towards Arnhem. The front line is suddenly much longer than it needs to be, and that requires more resources to hold it. And that means that, every landing craft you strip away is, a big loss when you suddenly have a front line that's much longer than it needs to be. So it's difficult to know, and it's something I'm certainly going to look into more as well. And I don't know if there's going to be any contemporary documentation about it, but if not, I'll just do my own analysis, I suppose, and see what I can come up with. But I think Infatuate couldn't have been that much earlier. I think only a couple of weeks earlier, probably.
Okay, I just thought it'd be worth showing while you were talking there, Nick Stanley's fantastic meme from yesterday, the one there with, I just think that's the funniest use of that meme for a long time, that one there. It's his light-hearted approach there. A quick question from Philip Brazier, who's actually gone now, but he's also done a show on the channel on the 79th at Walcheren a couple of years ago. But he's saying, Woody and Stephen, is Rawlings' Cinderella operation a decent starting point for understanding the death ride of the Support Squadron Eastern Flank?
Yes. So here we go.
Obviously, until your book is ready, but in the meantime,
So Rawlings was the Royal Marine gunnery officer on one of the Landing Craft Flak. I haven't worked out which one yet, because he doesn't say. He doesn't give his own personal experience. He's very much written a book, but I know it's one of 2 Landing Craft Flak. I've narrowed it down. It is a very good book. It is the first book to deal purely with Walcheren, so I'm sort of duplicating it. But it's small.
I've got that on the shelf somewhere.
There's a lot of background detail at the start as well. He does dedicate the first third of the book, if not more, to Switchback and Vitality and the background to it, which I won't be doing in as much detail. It is a good starting point, though. Yes, he uses the official reports, as I have been doing. So he uses the report from Support Squadron Eastern Flank that Sellars puts together with the reports of all of his landing craft commanders who are able to submit a report. I've found more documents that he doesn't use, so I'm using also the recommendations for decorations. I'm using the landing craft survivor statements from when they all get shipped back to the UK, and a statement they make about the loss of their vessel, and there's some really useful stuff in there. And there's other reports as well that I don't think he uses. And it's a great shame, I think, that he doesn't appear to give his personal experience. On a couple of occasions, he does say a Royal Marine officer on this landing craft, and I'm wondering if that's him. And I think I can work it out, so I'll try and pin it down. But yes, this is a very good starting point. For the wider Battle of the Scheldt, the very first place I read about the Support Squadron Eastern Flank was Dennis and Sheila Whitaker. I read this years and years and years ago, and I'd never really heard about Support Squadron Eastern Flank when I read this. And they only give it a page or two, to be honest, but just in that brief account, I was absolutely spellbound. I was like, how on earth? That's insane. And there's no disguising the level of involvement that they had and the level of sacrifice that they gave.
Well, I think anybody who's discovering this this Scheldt campaign for the first time, either via my channel or your tweets or Brad and OTD Military History, they're realizing there's a hell of a lot more to it. And it's anyone who is discovering it new, it's like, why the hell haven't I read about this before? Because it has so many elements that are not only interesting for the course of the war, but just interesting on a human emotional level. I mean, the accounts you gave us earlier were so good. So we will bring things to end. Otherwise, we'll be here all day, folks. We're off again to Operation Dragoon tomorrow. Antoine is joining us to talk about the French forces down in the south of France. Then we've got Brad coming on Thursday to do a deeper dive on the Walcheren Causeway, and then we've got the panel discussion with David O'Keefe, Arthur Glaxon, and Mike Bechtold on Monday. As always, buy my guests' books if you haven't already got that book, which is my guest's previous tome. And that's the kind of size book we want on Scheldt from you, Stephen. So you don't disappoint us, which I know you won't. Thanks, everybody, for supporting the channel. Thanks for your great questions. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers.